The Duke painted the woman from his dream before the dawn was an hour old, and 2 weeks later, on a colder October night, she knocked on his bedroom door by mistake and walked clean through the careful life he had built since boyhood. That is the story, in one breath. The slow telling of it begins on the night the dream came. Theodore Ashby, the 9th Duke of Renholm, woke in the great curtained bed at Renholm Park, with the face of an unknown woman pressed onto his mind, the way a candle leaves a mark on a polished oak table. The fire had burned to copper coals. The clock on the mantel ticked with its usual patient cough. Outside, an owl asked a question of the moonlight and got no answer. None of that had woken him. The face had. A woman he had never met, drawn in his sleep with such steady precision that he could count the small dark mole at the hinge of her jaw, the very pale scar above one eyebrow, the chip in her front tooth that showed only when she almost smiled. He pressed his palms to his cold eyes. The face remained. It refused to blur the way dream faces blur. It waited at the inside of his eyelids with patient courtesy. Theodore, who had been told since the age of 12 that he was the most disciplined young man in 3 counties, did the only sensible thing he could think to do at 4 in the morning. He got out of bed, pulled on his banyan, walked barefoot through the cold gallery to the small upstairs painting room at the north end of the house, and he began to draw her in oils before she could leave him. He worked, as he later remembered it, in a stillness that did not feel like working. He worked by the light of 2 beeswax candles and the slow rose of dawn through the east window. He had been a private painter since boyhood, the kind of habit that gentlemen of his rank were permitted to keep and were never expected to show. His mother, who had taught him, used to say that painting was a form of remembering you had not yet earned. He thought of her often when he mixed colors. He thought of her now. The face came onto the canvas with an obedience he had never known in his hand before. The hair was the color of wet oak after rain. The eyes were gray, with a green ring round the pupil. There was a small scar above one eyebrow, very pale, the kind a child gets falling from a low wall. Her mouth was set in the steady, considering way of a person who has been listening to someone tell a long story and has decided not to interrupt. The room smelt of linseed and turpentine, and the dry warmth of beeswax. The brushes lay in their tin in their old order, fattest at the back, sable at the front, each cleaned the night before in a small pewter jar of warm water. He had laid them as his mother had taught him, on a folded square of unbleached linen, and he had not, since he was 13, laid them otherwise. He chose the smallest of the sables for the green ring of the eye. He chose a worn, flat brush, with the bristles split at one corner from a too-hot day in August for the hair. He mixed the grey of the iris on a chip of slate, and held the chip against the candle, and watched the colour cool as the wax warmed. He found, when he came to the eyebrow, that his hand would not tremble. He had expected it to tremble. It did not. The scar took him 3 small, sure strokes. He sat back and looked at what he had done, and felt, in the bones of his wrists, the particular calm of a man who has been set a task he was made for, and did not know it. Outside, the first thrush of the morning began to argue with itself in the holly by the south wall. The kitchen chimney sent up a thin, grey ribbon of smoke. The dawn moved 1 inch further into the painting room. Theodore did not lift his head. He worked the corner of her mouth with the worn, flat brush, and he was, for those minutes, the most useful instrument he had ever been. He had not, since the death of his father, been able to forget for an hour together that he was the 9th Duke of an old name. The painting forgot that for him. By the time the under-housemaid came to lay the morning fire, the canvas was nearly complete. Theodore covered it with a length of green linen and stood blinking at the window. His shoulders ached. His ink-stained fingers smelled of linseed and turpentine. He had no notion who she was. He suspected she did not exist. He told himself, with the firmness of a young duke who had inherited too much too early, but he would not think of her again. He thought of her for 14 days. He thought of her at the breakfast table on the second morning, when the toast tasted faintly of coal smoke from a flue that had needed sweeping since August. He thought of her on the third, when the head gardener came in to ask about the planting of the new walnut along the South Drive, and he caught himself answering with the patience of a man considering a thing that did not concern him, very nearly. He thought of her on the fourth, when he rode out to the home farm and stood with his tenant, Mr. Loxley, by a fallen stretch of hedge, and listened to Loxley's quiet, slow speech about the price of hurdles. And he listened well, because he had been brought up to listen well. But the inside of his head was a small north room, with a green linen cloth, and a face beneath it. He thought of her on the fifth, when he wrote 3 letters. One to his sister Caroline at her school in Bath, one to the steward of his Devon estate, and one to the Bishop of Salisbury on the question of a curate's living. He sealed all 3 with the same brown wax. He addressed all 3 with the same steady hand. He thought of her under the wax. He thought of her under his hand. He had inherited Renholm at 22. His father, who had been a thin, quick, sharp-tempered man with a great gentleness about his eyes, had taken a chest in a winter river and had been carried out of the world inside 3 weeks. The matter of the dukedom had landed on Theodore the way an unread book lands on a table, with a small thud and a great deal of expectation. He had been steady about it. He had ridden the boundary of the estate with his steward for 6 days running. He had sat through the long, quiet interview with the family solicitor in Lincoln's Inn. He had spoken to the tenants gathered in the great hall on a wet March afternoon, and had told them, in plain sentences, that he intended to do as his father had done, and that he hoped they would help him do better. He had been 22. He had said all that without a tremor. The tremor had come later, in his own room, with his face against the cold panel of his own door. He had not spoken of the tremor to anyone since. It is necessary to say all this, for what came next, because it tells you what the man was made of. Theodore Ashby was a young man who had been given too much too early, and had decided, instead of resenting it, to be equal to it. He had a quiet, dry humor about the eyes, which his aunt found exasperating, and his valet treasured. He read 3 newspapers in the morning, and a stretch of Plutarch most evenings before bed. He could not abide a cruel man, nor a careless one. He had been advised by an old friend of his father's in the first year to learn to be feared. He had decided, after 6 months of trying, that he preferred to be useful instead, and had largely succeeded. The painting room was the one thing he kept to himself. Even his mother, towards the end of her life, had stopped asking to see his work. She had merely brushed her cheek against his shoulder when he came down from it of an evening, and had said, "Theodore, you smell of turpentine. Wash, please, before your father sees you." He had not painted a face from a dream until that October. He had painted hayricks. He had painted apple boughs in February. He had painted, once, a great storm over the Long Water, very badly, and had kept it because his mother had said it had the right honest fault in it. He had never painted a woman he had not met. He did not know, then, that he was beginning the only useful argument with his own life that he would ever begin. Heskett, his valet, noticed first. Heskett noticed everything, having been the valet of the 8th Duke of Renholm before he became the valet of the 9th, and being the kind of servant who treated his master's character the way a gardener treats a difficult rose. On the second morning, he found the green linen had slipped, and the painted woman was looking past him at the window. He replaced the linen without comment. On the 5th, he found Theodore standing before it with his coat half on. On the 7th, he found a candle burning in the painting room at 3 in the morning, and Theodore asleep in a chair, his cheek against the back of his hand. Heskett did not wake him. He set a coverlet over the Duke's knees, and went away to consider whether it was time to write to the Dowager. Heskett was a man of 53, with the long, careful face of a sheepdog, and the calm hands of an upper servant who had laid out 2 generations of dukes. He had come into the house at 14, as a boot boy under the late Duke's valet, and had risen by the slow, patient grades of an English manner. He had married, once, a kitchen maid in his 30s, who had taken the lung fever the second winter and had been carried out of the house in March. He had not married again. He had grown into the kind of servant who treated his master's character the way a gardener treats a difficult rose. He did not write to the dowager that week. He wrote to her instead on the 10th morning, when he found the painting room had been visited a 4th night in a row. And he wrote in his slow, careful copperplate, "Madam, I am not at liberty to say more, but His Grace would benefit from the customary autumn diversion at Renham, sooner rather than later, and I take the liberty of suggesting it." He sealed the letter with brown wax and gave it to the boy who rowed the post. He went back to his pantry. He laid out a clean cloth and counted spoons by the light of the south window. He had a very long patience. The postboy reached the dowager's house in Hampshire in 2 days. The dowager read the letter at her own breakfast table, set down her teacup, and said to her maid in the same breath, "Pack my black trunk. We go to Renhome on Friday." The dowager, Lady Margaret Ashby, the Duke's aunt and the chatelaine of Renhome in all but name, arrived a week into the autumn. She had not been summoned. She had felt, in the bones of her wrists, that her nephew was being foolish about something, and she rarely waited to be told what. She came with 2 carriages, 3 trunks, and a list of unmarried women whose mothers had begged her to bring them to her nephew's notice. She intended to host a small country gathering before Michaelmas. She intended, after that, to settle the Duke's future the way one settles an accounting book, line by line, signed. "I cannot like the look of you, Theodore," she said, putting her gloves down on the breakfast table with the precision of a woman setting a chess piece. "You sleep too little and you read too much. Have you taken up melancholy?" "I have not," he said. He swallowed a mouthful of tea. "I have been painting." "Painting what?" "Light, mostly." "You painted light when you were 14, my dear, and even then you were better at hayricks. Do not patronize me." "Who is the woman?" He met her eye over the rim of the cup. The dowager had the face of a fine, intelligent hawk, and she was as fond of him as she was capable of being fond of anyone. He had loved her since he was a boy of 4, crying in the orchard for a mother who would not come down. He owed her a great deal, and a great deal of his sleep. "There is no woman, Aunt Margaret." "Then there ought to be. I have invited 11 of them." He set the cup down too quickly. The saucer rang. 11. With their mothers, of course, and a chaperone or 2. The Hertfords, the Penbridges, Miss Cosway and her sister, the Lady Susanna, Miss Greaves of Lyme, who is musical, and Miss Briar, who is, I am told, surprising. Surprising in what way? The dowager smiled, the way she smiled at a hand of cards she meant to win. "I do not yet know. Her uncle is the Reverend Briar of Pulley, who has catalogued every fossil on the south coast, and married a Frenchwoman in 1798, which was foolish of him, but produced, by all accounts, a clever niece. I am told she draws. I am told she rides. I am told she made an old man weep at supper last Easter by speaking 3 sentences of perfect Italian to a Genoese sailor who had washed up at Lyme. She is 26. She is not a beauty in the showy way, but I am told she is very well looking, and I do not bring fools to your house." Theodore took a slow breath. The painted face on the upstairs canvas had a small scar above the eyebrow, and grey eyes ringed in green. He had told himself, 3 mornings running, that the woman did not exist. He had become, in 3 mornings, quite sure of this. He found his aunt watching him. "Send the invitations," he said. "They were sent on Tuesday." He laughed before he could stop himself. It came out drier than he had meant. "Then I dare say I had better learn the names." "That, my dear, is what I came to teach you." The 3 days between the dowager's arrival and the gathering were full of the small, useful chaos that fills a country house preparing for guests. The under-housemaids beat the long curtains in the south drawing-room until the bright dust rose in slow columns through the cold morning air. The head housemaid, Mrs. Combe, walked the bedrooms with her ring of keys and a list, and put fresh linen on 26 beds, and laid sprigs of dried lavender in the warming pans. The kitchen, under the steady command of Mrs. Pike, ordered up 2 crates of oranges from Bristol and 3 brace of pheasant from the Homewood. Mr. Beasley, the butler, brought up 6 bottles of claret from the lower cellar and held them up to the light at his pantry window before he set them down on the cold slate. Heskett brushed the Duke's coats. The undergrooms washed down the 2 best carriages and polished the brass on the gate of the south yard. Even the head gardener, who detested company, set his men to clipping the great yews of the orchard walk until they had the proper soft shoulder, and the orchard smelt sharply of fresh-cut yew for 2 days running. Theodore walked through his own house in this hum the way a man walks through a stream in summer, half present, half elsewhere, dry from the waist up and cool beneath. He saw to 100 small civilities. He signed 100 small papers. He covered, twice a day, the canvas in the painting room. The first carriages turned in at the gate 3 days later. The October wind was thin and gold, and the leaves of the great avenue beeches had begun to give up their colour in earnest. Theodore stood on the gravel in his blue coat, watching the line of teams come up the slope, and felt the strangeness of his own house. Wrenholme was not a small estate. It was a great pale block of Portland stone, 22 windows along the south face, a chapel to the east, a long water to the west, and woods on 3 sides. He had grown up here and inherited it at 22, and on most days he liked it the way a man likes a coat he has worn since boyhood, without thinking. Today he could feel the building behind him. He could feel the upstairs room where the green linen hung. He could feel the painted woman, waiting with her tooth half shown. The October wind came up in earnest just before noon, and the bronze leaves of the great avenue beeches began to fall in slow showers across the gravel. The carriage horses came up, steaming, their breath silver in the cold air. The whip leather creaked, the harness brass winked under a thin sun. Behind Theodore, the house held its breath. 22 windows along the south face, every pane wiped clean since dawn. The great oak doors thrown open to show the warm copper glow of the hall fire and the polished slate of the entrance. Miss Cosway arrived in a peach pelisse. Her sister wore the same. The Hertford girls were tall and looked at his shoulders as if measuring him for something. Lady Susanna Penbridge, who was an honest girl and could not help laughing when she was nervous, laughed 3 times in the time it took her to climb down. Miss Greaves of Lyme, who was the musical one, walked at her father's elbow and held a small black book the way a child holds a doll. There were mothers, and there were aunts, and there was a great deal of grey silk. Theodore made the bows he had been taught. He smiled. He felt, very distantly, like a man at his own funeral, except that he was expected to be charming about it. Miss Briar came down last, out of the smallest carriage, with no mother and no aunt, and a chaperone called Mrs. Lacey, who looked as if she preferred dogs to people. Miss Briar wore a travelling cloak the colour of moss, and the hood was down. Her hair was pinned up tightly for the road. She lifted her face to the house, and Theodore, who had been counting beech leaves to keep his expression in order, forgot, briefly, how to breathe. She had a small dark mole at the hinge of her jaw. He could see, from where he stood, that her front tooth was very faintly chipped. He could not, from this distance, see the green ring round the grey of her eye. He did not need to. He knew it was there. He had painted it on Tuesday. "Your Grace," said Mrs. Lacey, stepping out and offering a perfectly correct curtsy. "May I present Miss Eliza Briar of Pulley Vicarage?" He bowed. His hands were steady. His voice came out without trembling. "Miss Briar, you are very welcome to Wrenholme." She curtsied and said, "Thank you, Your Grace. The avenue is uncommonly fine. I counted the trees from the lodge and made it 96. 97, he said, before he knew he was going to say it. She looked up. The grey-green eyes met his. She did not flinch, and she did not flutter. She tilted her head very slightly, the way a person does who has been told something that does not quite fit and is too well-mannered to ask. "Then I shall have to count again at breakfast," if it does not put me out of countenance with my hostess." "My aunt will count with you," he said. "She enjoys disputing me." "That I can well believe." She smiled. The chipped tooth showed. He had to look away and across the lawn at a starling that was not there. The wind moved the bronze leaves in the avenue behind them. A footman came up with her small valise. The gravel crunched under his boots. Somewhere in the kitchen yard a copper kettle clanged. Mrs. Lacey's nostrils flared faintly at the cold. Eliza turned her face to the house and counted the windows on the south face with her grey eyes, very steadily, and Theodore knew, without watching her count, that she had made it 22 and was already filing the number away. There is a moment, in such gatherings, when a hostess has to choose where to put her chosen pieces. The dowager had chosen. She placed Eliza Breyer at the far end of the long drawing room, beside an east window with a view of the lawn, where the light at 4 o'clock fell with a generosity that was wasted on the other young women, but seemed, the dowager noted with a small, private displeasure, to land very kindly on a parson's niece in a moss-green gown. She placed Miss Cosway and Lady Susanna on the deep settee by the great fireplace, where the firelight would catch their jewellery. She placed the Hartford girls by the pianoforte. She seated the chaperones and the mothers at strategic angles. She set Mr. Hartford in the armchair nearest the brandy. She conducted the room the way a coachman handles a pair of greys. Theodore moved through the company as he had been taught. He spoke to Miss Cosway of her journey from town. He spoke to Lady Susanna of her father's health. He spoke to the Hartford girls about a horse he did not own. He bowed over Mrs. Lacey's gloved hand and asked her, very gravely, whether the chaperonage of Miss Breyer had given her cause to regret undertaking the journey. Mrs. Lacey, a grey-haired widow of 50, with the wrists of a woman who had spent her youth in a parish kitchen, looked at him steadily and said only, "It has given me no cause whatever to regret it, Your Grace. Miss Breyer is, in all respects, a person of credit to her uncle." She did not smile. She did not need to. Her plain, square face had a way of giving its yeses with no music, and they were the more reliable for it. Theodore inclined his head and moved on. He held back in the whole of the first afternoon and spoke no more than the courtesies of the room to Eliza Breyer. Once, twice, 3 times, his eye crossed her at the east window, and was caught and held for a beat too long, and was let go. He refused himself the small permission, when he passed her chair, to let his hand touch the back of it. He drank his tea. He listened with patience to Mr. Hartford's anecdote of the prince. He went, when the company broke up at the dressing bell, to his own dressing room, and stood at the long window, looking down on the dusk gravel and the bare avenue, and the canvas above him in the painting room, and felt the shape of his own life shifting around him, like the slow turning of a great ship at anchor. The first 3 days of the gathering passed the way such days do. They walked the long water. They were shown the picture gallery. He did not take them to the painting room. They played cards in the evenings. They were a great deal entertained at supper by Mr. Hartford, who could tell an anecdote of the late Prince Regent and bring it home without offence. Miss Greaves played the pianoforte. Miss Cosway and her sister sang a duet that began as Italian and confessed, by the second verse, that it was English. Lady Susanna laughed and was kind. The Hartford girls were polite and considered him at length. There were small physical pleasures in those evenings. The warm crackle of the great hall fire under the dry beech logs, the smell of beeswax on the long oak table, the faint, sharp tang of orange peel as the footman passed bowls of candied rind with the port. The candlelight fell on silk and silver, and on the polished wood of the floor, where the dancers, after supper, paced a slow country measure, with their slippers whispering on the parquet. The dogs of the household, 2 long-bodied spaniels and an old wire-haired terrier, slept across the hearthrug in a heap of warm fur and twitching paws. The dowager presided. Heskett, at the side table, polished a single glass with a linen cloth and kept his eye on the Duke. Miss Breyer said very little. She listened. She had the listening of a person who collected what she heard, the way a beachcomber collects glass. When she did speak, she spoke briefly, and one had the sense of a long shoreline behind the brief speech. On the second night, when Miss Greaves had played a complicated Italian air and looked round for praise, Miss Briar said, "That was the second of Cimarosa's, was it not? I have only heard it played as written. You added a hesitation in the third bar. I liked it." Miss Greaves, who had been steeling herself for the usual compliments, blushed almost to her hair. "You play?" she asked. "A little. I compose when I can be private. Not for company." Theodore, halfway across the room with a tray of sherry, set the tray down on the wrong table. His aunt was watching him. He took her arm at the end of the night, when the guests had gone up by candle, and said in a low voice that the painted picture had not been a coincidence, and he begged her to keep it private. The dowager, who had been a married woman and was a great aunt to 4 children and had buried 2 of her own brothers and 1 sister, said only, "Theodore, you are looking at me as if I might shatter. I am 64 years old and the daughter of a duke. I shall keep my counsel." He kissed the back of her hand. Her glove had been laid down on the table beside her, and her skin smelled very faintly of orange flower water, which she had used since he was a boy. He had kissed that hand at his confirmation, at his entry into Oxford, at the chapel door on the morning of his father's burial, and on no occasion since. He found his throat tight. "But my dear," she added very softly, "you must be sensible. She is the niece of a country parson. Her dowry is not large. You have a duty to the name, and I have invited you 11 women on its account. I cannot pretend this is convenient." "I have not asked you to pretend anything." "Then you have not yet asked, and I am giving you fair warning." The fire in the great hall had burned to copper coals. Heskett was waiting at the foot of the south stairs with a small candle, as he had waited for the Duke's father at the foot of this same stair for 30 years before. He did not speak. He inclined his head. He went up behind Theodore in the small, careful pace of an old servant, and at the door of the bedchamber he took the Duke's coat and his neckcloth and his cuffs, and laid them on a chair as he had laid them on every other night of the past 9 years. And he set down the candle on the side table, and he wished his master a quiet good night. He went up to bed at 1 in the morning. He did not visit the painting room. He could not bear that night to face the canvas. He lay on his back and looked at the underside of his own bed curtains, and tried very hard to remember the face of every woman he had met since he was 20, in some order, and could not. He could remember Eliza Briar's voice, however, with humiliating clarity, saying 96 trees. Sleep for Theodore that night was a country he could not enter. He lay on his back in the great curtained bed, and watched the faint sway of the bed curtains in the draught from the east window. The fire in his grate had been built up by Heskett before he had come up, and had settled into a steady red working under a small, bright blue flame, and the room held the warm, dry smell of beechwood and the cold under-smell of October beyond the window. He turned on his side. He turned on his back. He put his arm over his eyes. He thought of his sister Caroline at school, of the letter she had sent him in September, in which she had described, in 17 close-written lines, the precise dress she should like for her come-out, and which had ended with the careful afterthought, "I hope, dearest brother, that you are not lonely. I think of you in October." He had laughed when he read it, at the 17 lines, and had wept after, at the afterthought, with the small, ashamed weeping of a man of 27 who has been told the truth by a child of 16. He thought of his father, who, in the year before he was carried off, had said to him at this same window, "Theodore, you will marry for sense, or you will marry for affection, but you will not marry for a portion. I have seen it done. It hollows a house." He thought of his mother, who had married for affection at 21 against the express wish of her own father, and had been, by every account that had ever reached him, the happiest woman in 3 counties for the 11 years of her marriage, and who had, after his father's burial, faded, as Heskett put it, the way a candle fades that has not been replenished. He had not slept above a few hours when the knock came. It was a small knock, and not at all confident, and it came at the door of his own bedchamber, He thought, for an absurd second, that it was Heskett with the morning fire. But the fire had burned to nothing, and the room was very cold, and Heskett did not knock so quietly. He got out of bed, pulled his banyan round his shoulders, and went to the door. The corridor candle had guttered. Eliza Breyer stood in the dimness in a wrapper and a shawl, holding a small candle of her own in a brass dish. Her hair was loose and the colour of wet oak. Her feet were in slippers. She looked at him with the face of a person who had been crying very recently and had decided not to mention it. The chipped tooth was hidden. The mole at the hinge of her jaw was very plain. "I beg your pardon," she said. Her voice was steady, but only. "I have lost my way." He could not answer. He stood looking at her with his hand on the door jamb and his banyan half on, and he understood, with the calm finality of a man recognizing his own coat on the wrong peg, that he had painted her, and she had walked to him. She lowered her candle. She must have read something on his face that he had not meant to show, because the steadiness of her voice cracked a very little. "Your Grace," she said, "I am most dreadfully sorry. I thought this was the East Passage." "You are in the South," he said. His voice came out as if he were speaking from the other end of a long gallery. "2 staircases over." "I had been writing," she said, with the careful politeness of a guest who is determined to give an account of herself. "I could not sleep. I went for a glass of water. The footman who showed me down had gone to bed, and I took the wrong turning at the picture gallery. I did not mean to knock on a door at this hour. I thought it was Mrs. Lacey's. I beg you to forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive." She managed a small, formal nod. She turned. Her shawl slipped on her shoulder, and she caught it with the steady gesture of a person who had caught a great many shawls in a great many cold rooms. He said her name. Just that. "Miss Breyer." She turned back. There was a long moment in which they only looked. He saw her face by the small candle. She saw his by no candle at all. He thought afterwards that what he must have looked like, in his banyan, with his hair loose and his face white, was a man who had been hit in the chest by something he could not quite name. She thought, afterwards, that he had looked like a man who had been waiting a long time at a window and had finally seen what he was waiting for. The small brass dish of her candle trembled in her hand. Wax slipped down the side and gathered in a soft, white pearl. The corridor smelt of old wood polish and the cold of an unheated wing. From somewhere far off in the kitchen yard came the slow tread of a footman on his way to the cellar. The house breathed around them. She set her candle very carefully on the floor. "Your Grace," she said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I should be grateful if you would not pretend it is a usual question. Have you and I met?" He breathed in. He breathed out. "No, I thought not." She looked at the carpet between them. "I have, however, dreamed of you. I have dreamed of you for 14 nights. The first dream was a Wednesday. You were standing in a window with the sun behind you. I painted you the next morning. I painted you in watercolors because I had no oils. I have never told a living soul. I should not be telling you. But you have just looked at me as if you knew me, and I should like to be honest before I go away." He found that he was holding his breath. He let it out. "I have not," he said, "the language to answer this properly, but I will try. I dreamed of you on the night of the 5th of October. I painted you the following morning in oils, in the small upstairs room at the north end of this house. I have kept the canvas under a length of green linen. I have not shown it to anyone. I did not know who you were. I did not know that you existed. I learned your name in the gravel 3 days ago from a chaperone who prefers dogs to people." A wisp of her loose hair shifted at her temple. The brass dish of the candle on the floor cast a small, warm circle around her slippered feet. The corridor stretched away into pitch dark behind her shoulder. She gave a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She does prefer dogs. I have been counting trees ever since. 97, I believe." 97. They stood. The candle on the floor steadied between them. Somewhere along the gallery, a clock told the 3rd quarter after 2. "I do not understand it," she said. "Nor I. It is not a usual thing. It is not. I am not afraid of it." He let out a breath that had been waiting in him a long time. "Nor I." A cold draught from the south wall lifted the hem of her wrapper a 1/4 of an inch and set it down again. The candle on the floor between them guttered and steadied. A door, very far off, closed softly somewhere in the wing. She picked her candle up off the floor. She did it gravely. She did not look at him for a long moment, and when she did, she met his eyes the way she had on the gravel, with no flinching. "I shall go back," she said. "Mrs. Lacey will worry. She told me before I came that she should not sleep until I was a married woman, and I have given her no rest. I have no idea what I am to do with this. I have no idea what you are to do with it. We have known each other a 1/4 of an hour, and I have stood in your doorway in a wrapper, and the only thing I am quite certain of is that I am not sorry." "Nor I," he said for the 3rd time. "Good night, Your Grace." "Theodore," he said, "if you would, tonight, in the corridor. Theodore." She considered this. She had a way of considering that gave her face the gravity of a portrait. "Theodore," she said. "Good night." She turned and walked along the corridor with her candle held very level, and she did not look back. Theodore stood in his doorway until the small light of her had turned the corner. Then he went back into his cold room and sat on the edge of his bed in his banyan, and laughed once, very quietly, and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, the way a man does when he has been struck by good fortune and is not yet sure what it will cost. He did not sleep. He watched the dawn come up grey over the long water. He watched a heron stand in the shallow at the south end as if it had been asked to be there. He thought, with absurd irrelevance, that he must remember to ask her if she had ever painted a heron. He thought, with no irrelevance at all, that he had been a duke for 7 years, and had never until this hour properly known what he was for. A grey dawn came up beyond the long water. The kitchen chimney sent up its thin ribbon of smoke. The first scullery maid clattered her pails in the cold yard. The under-housemaid lit fires in the breakfast room and the small parlour, and laid the long table with fresh linen and the heavy plate, and the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread came up the south staircase. She came down to breakfast at 9:30, very neatly dressed, her hair done with the modest competence of a young woman who had no maid to fuss over her, and she sat at the far end of the table and ate her eggs as if she had slept without incident. Theodore, who had been schooled to be civil at all times, found himself civil to everyone but her. To her he was only formal. He could not bear to risk anything. The dowager watched both of them and ate her toast with both hands. "Miss Briar," said the dowager, in the unhurried voice that had ended marriages and started two. "I am told you draw." "A little, Mum." "Have you brought any work?" "A few sketches, Mum, and a small folio of miniature portraits." "Miniatures?" The dowager set her toast down. "May we see?" Eliza coloured very faintly. "If it would amuse the company. They are not professional work. They are made for friends." There was a small silence at the table. The Hartford girls turned their faces towards her with the slow attention of people who had not yet decided what to make of the moss-green stranger. Miss Causeway set down her teacup. Lady Susanna leaned a fraction forward. Mrs. Pike's footman, refilling the pot at the sideboard, paused with the kettle in his hand and looked across the heads of the ladies at the Duke, then went on pouring. She went up and came down with a small, flat leather case, which she opened on the breakfast table after the cloth had been cleared. The miniatures were on ivory, no larger than a thumb. There were 11 of them. There was an old man with the sea light in his eyes, who must have been her uncle the Reverend. There was a small, dark-haired boy at a window. There was a woman in a green shawl looking down at her own hands. There was a girl who had clearly been laughing the instant the painter caught her, the chip of her tooth showing exactly the way Eliza's did. There was a sailor with the rope mark of the trade still on his palm. There was an old woman with a kitten asleep on her wrist. The work was, by any measure, very fine. The faces breathed. The Hartford girls bent over them and were silent. Miss Greaves of Lyme picked up the boy in the window and said, after a long moment, "Goodness." Theodore, who had been keeping a careful distance, came to the edge of the table. "You have a remarkable hand, Miss Briar," he said. "I have not seen better work outside Cosway's studio." "Mr. Cosway was kind enough to teach me 3 summers in Bath, when his health permitted," she said, very evenly. "He gave me the ivory I work on. I am not at liberty to show his correspondence." The dowager raised her eyes from a miniature of a small grey dog, and looked at her nephew the way she had looked at him when he was 8 and had broken the orangery glass. Her look said, "This is the surprising niece, and you knew nothing about her until last night." Her look also said, "Be careful, Theodore." Her look added, almost reluctantly, "And yet." He did not stay in the breakfast room. He passed, on his way through the long gallery, the small inner door of the dowager's own sitting room, which had been opened a hand's breadth by a careless undermaid, and not closed. He did not mean to look. He looked. He saw, by chance, his aunt seated alone at her writing desk by the south window. The small leather case of Eliza's miniatures lay open on the desk before her. She held in her steady grip one of the 11 miniatures, the one of the woman in the green shawl, looking down at her own hands, lifted to catch the light. The dowager was not aware that anyone could see her. Her habitual ramrod posture had softened. She had taken her spectacles from the case at her elbow and put them on, which she never did before company. The light came in over her shoulder and lit the silver hair at her temple. He watched her, in the absolute silence of the corridor, turn the small painted ivory in her hand once, and twice, and a third time, slowly, the way one turns a thing whose value has surprised one. He watched her set the miniature down at last on the green leather, very gently. He watched her sit a moment longer, with her hand flat over the case as if shielding it, and her face turned to the window, and her mouth not quite firm. She made no sound. She wept no tear. She did only sit. He held his own breath. He moved on, past the door before she could become aware of him, and he went down the south stairs with the small, useful knowledge of a man who had just been shown something he was not meant to see. He did not at the time understand what it would do to him. He understood only that his aunt, for one private minute over a stranger's miniature, had not been the chatelaine of Renholm, nor the daughter of a duke. She had been some woman remembering some other woman, in a shawl, in some other house. He went on, out across the terrace, with his hands behind his back, and walked the lower terrace twice, and the upper terrace once, and then went up to the painting room, and stood before the canvas. He pulled the green linen away. The face on the canvas looked back at him, with the steady, considering gaze he had now seen across a breakfast table over toast. He could not have been more shaken if she had spoken from the linen seam. He covered it again. He went down. He found Eliza Briar reading in the long library, alone, with her finger marking the place. The library smelt of leather and old paper, and the faint, pleasant tang of the slow-burning logs in the grate. A long window at the south end let in a strip of pale October sun that lay across the floor in a yellow bar. A small dust danced in the bar. She did not start. She turned a page and finished the sentence she was on, the way a woman does who is at home in a room. "I should like to show you something," he said. "It is not, I think, a usual thing to show. I should like to show it nonetheless." She set the book down very carefully. "Yes." The back staircase smelt faintly of damp stone and beeswax. The wooden treads gave under their slippered feet with the slow, polite creak of old oak. Eliza moved up ahead of him, with the steady step of a person who had spent a great deal of her life on narrow stairs. He took her upstairs by the back staircase, which was used by no one but the housekeeper. He pulled the green linen from the canvas and stood out of her line of sight. The painting room was cold. The morning sun had moved off the east window. The smell of linseed and turpentine had thinned to the dry, clean smell of old wood and beeswax. The brushes lay in their tin in their old order. The chip of slate where he had mixed the grey iris that October dawn lay on the small folding table by the wall. The colour cooled to a dull pewter. She made no sound at all. She walked round the canvas. She walked back. She stood for a long time at the place from which the eye of the painted woman looked out. She put one hand to her own jaw, very lightly, at the place of the mole. "You painted my chipped tooth," she said. "I painted it the morning after the 5th of October. I had the colour of your hair wrong. I had it the colour of wet oak in the rain. I see now it is darker at the temple than I made it. It is wet oak in the rain in the autumn. In the summer it is fairer. I shall make a note." She gave a soft, broken laugh, and then she did not laugh. She kept her hand at her jaw. "Theodore," she said, and that name in the painting room sounded utterly different from the name in the corridor. "I painted you in watercolour. I have it in my smaller case, beneath my hairpins. I will show you when we go down. We are not mad. I refuse to be mad. We are something else. I cannot name what we are, and I will not pretend, before I am 26, to understand my own bones. I have not been pretending to understand mine for a fortnight. Two of us, then. Two not pretending." She turned to face him. The light from the small north window of the painting room fell across her cheek and lit the green ring of her iris. The faint scar above her eyebrow was very pale. He could smell, at this nearness, the lavender water she used, and the cold of the back staircase still clinging to her cloak. "My uncle taught me, when I was 13, that there are facts in the world for which we have not yet earned the words. He would say, 'Do not be frightened by what you cannot name. Be courteous to it. Look long. Make notes.' Your uncle is a sensible man." "He is the most sensible person in the south of England." "I should like to meet him." "He should like to meet you. He does not approve of dukes on general principle. He may be persuaded in the particular." She covered the painting again with her own hands, gently, the way she might have laid a cloth over a sleeping infant. She turned and went down the stairs ahead of him without a word, and at the foot of the stairs she went one way and he went another, and at the door of the long library she looked back over her shoulder and said only, "Tonight, after supper, the orchard. If your aunt asks, tell her you are showing me the russets." "There are no russets in my orchard." "Then we are both lying. I shall meet you there." The dowager did not ask. The dowager watched. At supper she put Eliza at the far end of the table, beside an elderly cousin from Wiltshire who was deaf in one ear, and she put Miss Cosway and Miss Greaves at her nephew's right and left, and she conducted the conversation with the steady authority of a coachman keeping 6 horses to the road. Theodore did everything that was required of him. He talked of the harvest. He laughed at Mr. Hartford's anecdote of the prince. He praised Miss Greaves's playing. He did not look at Eliza Breyer, and Eliza Breyer did not look at him. And twice in the course of the meal his aunt's eyes found his with the particular calmness that meant she had decided to fight him. The dinner ran very long. The fire in the great hearth threw a steady warm light onto the polished oak of the table and onto the cool silver of the cutlery. Mrs. Pike sent up a brace of partridge in a claret sauce, a saddle of mutton, a dish of forced asparagus, 3 sorts of jelly, a pyramid of small white pears, and a Stilton cheese laid out on a vine leaf. The conversation went steadily under the dowager's hand. Theodore answered when he was spoken to. Eliza answered when she was spoken to. They did not speak to each other. After supper he went to the orchard. The night was cold, with the small, clean smell of frost not quite arrived. The grass along the terrace gave faintly underfoot. A fox barked once in the lower wood, and went silent. Theodore could hear the slow lap of the long water against the stone of the bathing step. He could hear his own pulse at his ear. The moon was 3 nights from full, and laid a silver track across the lawn. The orchard lay south of the kitchen garden, behind the yew walk, where the ground sloped down toward the long water. It was full of old apple trees that the head gardener insisted were the same trees that had stood there in his grandfather's time. The October moon was 3 nights from full, and the leaves were thick under his boots. Eliza was there before him, in a dark cloak, her hood up against the dew. "You did not bring a lantern," he said. "I should be a poor secret if I did." He took her hand. It was cold. He set it inside his coat against his own ribs to warm it, and she did not pull away. They stood under an apple tree that had been there for 60 years. "I cannot offer you anything in form before I have spoken to my uncle," she said. "I shall write to him tonight. He will reply within 3 days. He is not a fast man with a pen, but he is a reliable one. I should also tell you, before we go any further with each other, that I have very little money. I have my mother's ring, and her piano, and a folio of miniatures, and the better part of £300. I have an opinion or two. I have a fault." "Tell me the fault." "I am stubborn. I am stubborn the way a stone is stubborn. I do not change my mind because I have been pressed. I change my mind because I have been shown. My uncle says it is the only useful kind of stubbornness, but it is exhausting in a wife. I have been told my fault since I was 12, he said. I am too disciplined. I do not laugh enough. I have been told it by my aunt, by my valet, and by the head groom, in that order. I should like to learn to laugh more. I think I have begun this week. I have heard you laugh once. Have you? At breakfast, when I said I had counted 96 trees. You did not laugh out loud. You laughed in your shoulders. It was, on the whole, a satisfactory laugh. Then I shall do it again. She smiled. The chip of tooth showed. He kissed the back of the hand he was warming against his ribs, very lightly, the way a man kisses a relic. And she made a small sound, and then a steadier one. Theodore. Yes? I should like to be courted. I should not like to be married next Tuesday. Nor I. I should like to be courted for a season. I should like to meet your tenants. I should like to see your stables and your kitchens. I should like to be sure of you in all weathers before I am bound. You shall have all the weathers I have. They stood under the apple tree until the dew began to settle on their hair, and they did not kiss, although they came near it once, and they did not need to. He took her back to the house by the side gate. He delivered her to Mrs. Lacey in the small parlour. Mrs. Lacey looked at him with the unblinking patience of a woman who had spent 30 years watching young people make decisions. He inclined his head. He went up to bed. Dawn came up cold and clean. The frost on the lawn lay in a thin, glittering crust. The east window of his bedroom was rimmed with a faint white tracery of ice. The fire in his grate had gone to grey ash. He woke at 5 and went to the painting room and painted, for the first time in his life, his own face from memory. He found he did not know how he looked. He found, after some time, that he had painted a man with rather more humour about the eyes than he had ever thought he had. He set the canvas beside the canvas of Eliza. He covered them both with the green linen. He went down to breakfast. The dowager was up before him. She was sitting in the small breakfast room with the post in 2 neat piles in front of her. The fire was very high. Theodore knew before he sat down that there was going to be a fight. "Theodore," she said, "sit, please. I shall be brief." He sat. "You are in love with Miss Briar?" "Yes." "You have decided you are going to court her?" "Yes." "You have not spoken to me about it." "I am speaking to you now." She poured him his coffee. She set the pot down with great precision. "I have, as you know, the deepest affection for you. I have stood as a mother to you since you were 4. I am asking, before I say anything more, that you remember the position from which I speak. I am not your enemy. I am the woman who taught you to ride your first pony, and I am the woman who held your hand at your father's interment, and I am the woman who sat with you the winter you had the lung fever, and would have been carried off if Heskett and I had not taken it in shifts. I remember. Good. Now, listen to me. Miss Briar is a very fine young woman. She is gifted. She is well bred on her father's side and not poorly bred on her mother's. And she has the cleverness of a person who has read more than she has been allowed to say. I do not despise her. I have spent 4 mornings observing her and 3 evenings speaking with her, and I find her, in herself, remarkable. I should be delighted to know her as a friend in this house. But you are the 9th Duke of Renham. You have 8,000 acres, a tenant roll of 240 families, a Westminster seat that comes with the title, an estate in Devon, a townhouse in Mayfair, and a sister at school in Bath who will need a dowry of £15,000 by 1820. You have a name that has been kept in the front of the house for 400 years. You owe that name a wife, who brings a name back to it. Miss Cosway has a portion of £40,000, and a mother who knows everyone. Lady Susanna Penbridge has the Duke of Marlbridge for an uncle, and a portion of £25,000. Miss Briar has £300, a folio of miniatures, and a parson uncle. I am not blind to her excellences. I am asking you to be unblind to the rest. I am unblind to the rest. Then you are foolish. Aunt Margaret. No. Theodore, I shall have my say. You are foolish because you imagine you are choosing between a woman and a column of pounds. You are choosing between a woman and the security of every soul who depends on you. You are choosing between a face you saw in a dream and the roof on 100 cottages, and you know it. You are choosing between your own happiness and your sister's marriage, and you know that too. I am asking you to look at it without flinching. I am not asking you to give her up. He set his coffee down. He felt the muscles between his shoulders go tight. What are you asking? I am asking you to take a season. I am asking you to write to the Duke of Marlbridge as a courtesy, since he is an old friend of your father's, and I have known his wife since I was a girl. I am asking you to permit Miss Cosway and Lady Susanna a fair hearing before you decide. I am asking you to court Miss Briar if you must, but to court the others as well, for the space of 1 season in town, and to make your decision at the end of it, with the books of the estate open before you. If at the end of that you choose Eliza Briar, I shall stand witness at the chapel myself, and I shall buy her ivory by the pound. And if I refuse, you will not refuse. I refuse. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She did not raise her voice. Then I shall be sorry for you. I shall be sorry for your tenants. I shall be sorry for your sister. And I shall, when I am in town next spring, hear nothing said in your favour, because there will be nothing favourable to be said. You will not stand against me. I will not stand for you, Theodore. There is a great difference. He stood up. He put his serviette down on the table. He felt, with the clarity he had not felt since he was 17 and had refused to enter the church, that the room had turned 3 degrees colder. I love you, he said. I love you, and I shall not be moved on this. He went out. The terrace was cold. The sun, when it came out from a long grey cloud, struck the wet flagstones and lifted a small steam from them. The long water lay still as a piece of slate. The heron stood at the south end on 1 leg. The wind moved his hair. He walked along the long water for an hour. He met Heskett at the bench near the south gate, who had been pretending to mend a stirrup, but had clearly been waiting for him. Heskett did not speak. He handed Theodore a small flask of brandy, set it on the bench, and walked away. Theodore did not drink. He held the flask against his palm and watched the heron, and tried to think. He thought of his father, who had been carried off when Theodore was 22 by a chest taken in a winter river, and had left him 8,000 acres and a long list of opinions. He thought of his mother, who had taught him to mix colours, and had followed her husband out of the world before Theodore was 25. More, the doctors said, from grief than from any settled sickness. He thought of his sister Caroline at school in Bath, who was 16 and silly and dear, and would need £15,000 by Christmas of next year. He thought of the tenants. He thought of the cottages with their new slate, paid for last spring, and the wages of 14 footmen, 11 maids, 3 coachmen, the head gardener, the under-gardeners. He thought of the pew in the chapel where his mother had sat. He thought of his aunt, whom he loved. He thought of Eliza Breyer laying her hand to her own jaw at the place of the mole. The flask sat warm in his palm. The brass cap caught the cold light. The heron at the south end of the long water lowered his other leg and stood on 2 for the first time in an hour, then folded one again. A coot piped from the reed bed. The wind shifted to the west. He went back to the house at noon. He spent the afternoon with the estate books. He did not see her until dinner. At dinner, she was placed once more at the far end of the table, between the deaf cousin and a curate. She gave no sign. The dowager was in her usual chair at his left. Miss Cosway was at his right. He was pleasant to Miss Cosway. He found, with relief that surprised him, that she was a kind girl, and not at all a foolish one, and that he liked her very much, and would never be in love with her. He told her, when the meal was over and the ladies were leaving, that her singing had been a great pleasure. She blushed and was grateful, and did not push for more. The dowager watched and said nothing. The house slept around them. The long clock in the hall struck the 11:45 as he passed it on his way out, with the slow, patient tick that had measured his boyhood. The garden door at the south end was kept on a single bolt at night, drawn back by the head footman before he himself went up. Theodore slid it noiselessly and stepped out into the cold. The frost was not quite settled yet. The yew walk smelt sharply of fresh cut. He went down the path without a lantern by the memory of his own feet. He met Eliza by the orchard gate at midnight. He did not have a lantern. She did not have a candle. The moon was nearly full now, and the apples were dark on the trees. "My aunt has put it to me plain," he said. "She will not bless this. She will not work against me, but she will not stand for me. She has asked me to take a season in town and consider the rest before I decide." "What did you say?" "I said I refused." "Theodore, I will not be moved." She put both her hands on his arms. Her palms were cold even through the wool of his coat. She held him as a person holds a stubborn child by the elbows. The pulse at her throat moved very evenly. The moon laid a small silver line along the curve of her temple. "I will not have you do that for me," she said. "I will not have you refuse her for me before I have written to my uncle. I will not have your sister's dowry depend on whether you have been brave with your aunt in October. Listen to me. We are not children. We are 2 grown people who have between us, by some grace neither of us understands, been shown each other early. We do not have to spend that grace badly. I have not been brave. I have only been certain. Then be certain in March." He laughed. "You want me to court Miss Cosway?" "I want you to be sure of me in all weathers. I told you that under the apple tree on Wednesday. I want to be sure of you. I do not want you in March to wake one morning and think, I refused my aunt in October and have a parson's niece on my arm and an empty Mayfair house. I want you to wake in March and say, I have heard all the others now, and the only one I want is the one who knocked on my door by mistake. That is not who I am. It is who I should like you to be." He set his forehead against hers. The October moon was on the apples behind her. He could smell the orchard and the cold and the very faint trace of the lavender water she had used. "How long?" "Until the end of the season. Until Whitsun. I shall be in Bath with my uncle until then. I shall write to you twice a week. I shall not see you. I shall not hold your hand under any apple tree. I shall not appear by some accident in your bedroom corridor by mistake. I should like to. I shall not. At Whitsun, If you have been to every ball and have heard the Duke of Marlbridge and have looked the estate books in the face, and you still want a parson's niece who cannot bring you a pound, then I am yours. And if I bring my aunt round before Whitsun? A small wind moved the orchard. An owl far off in the lower wood asked its old question. Theodore felt, against his rib, the warm, patient pressure of her cold palm. Then come and tell me. And if at Whitsun you have decided you do not want me? She did not flinch. She looked at him very steadily under the apples. I shall not have decided that. You cannot promise. I can promise. I've been at this longer than you have. I painted your face in a watercolor on the morning of the 6th of October at 6 in the morning, before I had heard your name. I am not a girl who chooses lightly. I have chosen. He could not answer. The orchard was very still. The cold smelt of apples on the ground and of wet bark, and of the first faint sharpness of frost. A blackbird in the lower wood gave one slow chuck and was silent. He held her against him for a long moment in the orchard, and the moon moved 1 inch in the sky, and somewhere a fox barked. He let her go. The apple bough above them shifted in the cold wind, and dropped a single dry leaf onto her shoulder. He brushed it away with his thumb. She did not move. The frost had begun to settle in earnest now along the grass at the foot of the trees. Until Whitsun, he said. Until Whitsun. They walked back together to the side gate. She put up her hood. He bowed over her hand at the door of the small parlour. Mrs. Lacey was awake by the fire with a piece of mending in her lap, and she looked at him without a word. And he looked at her with the look of a man who has decided to spend a winter mastering himself. Mrs. Lacey nodded once. She approved, she did not approve. She would keep her mistress safe. She went back to her mending. A grey October morning broke very cold over the gravel. The grooms brought round the small chaise. The breath of the horses rose in clouds against the dark line of the avenue beeches. The underfootman carried down the trunks. Heskett, in a clean black coat, stood at the foot of the south steps with his hands clasped behind his back. Eliza left Wren home at 8 the next morning, with the smallest of the trunks and the most modest of the cloaks. Theodore watched from the south steps until the carriage turned out of the avenue at the lodge. The dowager stood at his shoulder. He did not look at her. "You will not regret this, Theodore," she said. "I shall not say so again, but I shall say so once." "You may say so as often as you like, Aunt Margaret. It will not change me." "I do not wish to change you. I wish to keep you whole." He turned at last and met her eyes. She did not flinch. She was the woman who had held his hand at his father's interment. "I know," he said. "Then come in. Your breakfast is cold." The autumn closed in. The other guests went home in 2s and 3s. Wrenhome emptied. The long water turned grey, and then the colour of pewter, and then, by St. Andrew's Day, the colour of slate. The wind came up from the east on the first morning of November. It came hard and cold across the long water, and rattled the shutters of the south face, and shook the last bronze leaves down off the beeches in the great avenue. Theodore stood at his bedroom window and watched the leaves come down. The smell of wood smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. The smell of cold stone rose from the gravel. The smell of wet leather rose from his own boots, which he had not yet put on. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and felt the chill of it move into his temple. The pulse at his throat slowed. He missed her with the sharp, particular ache of a wound that has not yet decided whether to heal cleanly or to leave a scar. He missed her in his hands first, the way a man misses a brush he has set down in another room. He missed her at his shoulder. He missed her in the small, chipped tooth he had painted in oil in the upstairs room. He went out into the cold morning and walked along the long water until his ears ached and his cheeks stung, and he came back warmer than he had been when he set out, and he ate his breakfast with a quiet appetite, and he wrote a letter to his sister Caroline that filled 2 sides of a sheet and ended, very simply, I am, on the whole, well. November came slow and cold over the long water. Theodore rode the boundary of the home farm in a thin drizzle on the last day of October, with Mr. Loxley at his elbow and the understeward, Mr. Grimes, riding behind on a sturdy bay. He saw to the slating of 3 cottages at Wenton Cross. He approved the felling of a wind-blown elm at the bend by the South Lodge. He sat at his desk for 2 long evenings with the steward's books open in front of him and a single tallow candle at his elbow, and worked through the rents and the wages and the matter of his sister's portion by his own hand. He did not need to do it by his own hand. He chose to. He found, by midnight on the 2nd evening, that the books were honest, that the estate was sound, that his aunt had spoken to him in October with the urgency of a woman frightened by his face rather than by his ledgers. He set the books down. He went to bed with a great calm in his chest. He failed, that night, to dream of Eliza Breyer. He dreamt instead, with absurd vividness, of his father, walking the long avenue at dusk, with one hand on the head of a black retriever, and woke at 5 not sorrowful, but quiet, as if a long sentence had been finished in him properly at last. Theodore went up to town the 2nd week of November. The townhouse in Mayfair had been kept on a holding establishment of 3 servants and a steward through the autumn, and on his arrival, the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenton, lit fires in all 6 receiving rooms and aired the bedrooms, and produced, by some quiet miracle of management, a hot supper of mutton and turnips on a clean cloth at 7 o'clock on the very evening he arrived. Theodore ate it at the small table in his library, with the curtains drawn against the smoke and noise of Curzon Street, and he wrote afterwards to Eliza by the same candle, a short letter, 4 sides only, that said almost nothing of his feelings, and a great deal about a fossil he had seen at a dealer's in Piccadilly that morning, which he thought her uncle would value. He signed himself, with proper modesty, "Yours always, Theodore." He sealed the letter. He gave it to the night footman at 11:30 for the morning post. He climbed the cold staircase to his bedroom with a candle. He slept well. He took his seat in the house. He attended the dinners. He danced with Miss Cosway twice, and with Lady Susanna twice, and with the Hertford girls once each, and he was polite to all of them, and a friend to several. And he was not in love with any of them, and they were all of them too well bred to pretend otherwise. The ballrooms of that winter ran together in his memory afterward as one long room. The cold tile of an entrance hall, the warm smell of beeswax and powder, the slow press of silk against silk on the staircase, the bright twang of a violin tuning, the small dry rasp of the master of ceremonies announcing arrivals. He felt at all of them the strange double consciousness of a man whose body was in one room and whose heart was in another. He bowed, he smiled. He led his partners through the slow figures of a quadrille with the same patient care he used in choosing a horse. He came home each night to his cold townhouse and ate cold beef in his library and slept badly and woke at dawn and wrote 3 lines to Eliza on the writing desk by the window. He sent the lines by the night post. He kept, in the end, every one of his appointments. The streets of London that winter were thick with the smoke of sea coal and the rattle of the iron-tired drays on the cobbles. The Thames was a great grey sliding mussel below Westminster Bridge. The squares of Mayfair smelt of damp stone and horse and of the small wood smoke from the railed gardens where the lamplighters came out at 4 in the afternoon with their long brass poles, and the green twilight came up early. Theodore walked. He walked because he could not be still. He walked from Curzon Street to St. James's by way of Piccadilly, and back by Pall Mall in the slow dusk, with his hands behind his back under his caped coat. And he watched the lamps come on, one after another, and the wet pavement gather and double the light. He thought, very often, of October. He thought once, with quiet amusement, that he had become the very kind of melancholy young duke whose existence he had refused to believe in at 23. Miss Cosway's mother, who was a sensible woman, drew him aside in February and said, "Your Grace, I shall withdraw my daughter from your attention, if you will permit me. She is fond of you, and I do not wish her to be foolish. Lord Welbeck has been asking. I shall encourage him. I tell you this as a courtesy, because my husband admired your father." He kissed her hand. He thanked her for her plainness. He went home to his townhouse and wrote to Eliza. The Duke of Marlbridge, whom his aunt had wished him to consult, was an old man of 74, with white whiskers, and a careful affection for Theodore that had been inherited, like the rest of Marlbridge's possessions, from his own father. Theodore went to see him in his townhouse in Berkeley Square on the 3rd Tuesday of December. Marlbridge received him in a small, wainscoted room with the fire built high, and they sat across from each other in 2 old leather chairs with a decanter of port between them on a low table. Marlbridge listened. Marlbridge listened the way old men listen who have been bored by drawing-room politics for 40 years and have learned to spot the rare, honest sentence on a young man's face. Theodore set out the case. He said the woman was a parson's niece. He said her portion was £300. He said she drew miniatures of an excellence he had not seen outside Cosway's studio, and that her uncle had catalogued half the fossils on the south coast, and that her chaperone, who was no flatterer, called her in private a person of credit. He said his aunt had asked him to consider the rest, and that he was considering it. He said he was in love. He said the word plainly, without theatre, the way another man might say, "I have a fever." Marlbridge nodded. He drank his port. He poured Theodore another glass. "You are very like your father, Theodore," he said at last. "He came to me in this room when he was 28, and he sat in that very chair, and he told me he was in love with a woman who had no money and a difficult sister and a great deal of opinion. I told him then what I shall tell you now. I shall not advise you against her. I shall advise you only this. A great estate is not yours, my boy. It is yours in trust. Your wife must be equal to that trust. If your Miss Briar is so, by your honest reckoning of her, then marry her with my blessing, and tell your aunt that an old man in Berkeley Square has set his hand to the choice. If she is not equal to it, then in 3 years, when the first hard winter comes and 100 families want bread, you will both be sorry. I do not think you are a fool. Decide as you would decide on the price of a hurdle, with your eyes open." Theodore did not speak for a moment. He thought of Eliza's hand laid against her own jaw at the place of the mole. He thought of her face above the miniatures on the breakfast tablecloth. "She is equal to it, sir." "Then there is nothing more to say. Bring her to me at Whitsun. I shall give her tea. I shall be insufferable to her for a quarter of an hour, to see what she is made of. After that I shall sign my name in your registry as a witness, and I shall settle a small thing on your second daughter, if it pleases God to send you a second daughter. Go home." Theodore went home. He spoke to his sister Caroline at the Christmas holidays. She had been sent up from Bath by the school, under the chaperonage of a Mrs. Tuke, who fell asleep in the carriage at Maidenhead and woke only at Hyde Park Corner. Caroline, at 16, was a thin, tall girl with the family bones and a startling new dignity she had acquired in the course of one Bath winter. She had been told by the Dowager, in a private letter she did not yet know Theodore had read, that her brother was contemplating an unwise marriage. She had read the letter twice. She had folded it. She had said nothing. She had spent the carriage journey thinking. She walked into the library of the townhouse on the 2nd day of Christmas, with her hands folded at her waist and her chin set, and she said, "Theodore, I should very much like to be told the truth, and I should rather you did not soften it. I am a sensible person." He had laughed at her, because he loved her, and he had then told her the truth, without softening it. He had told her of the dream, and the painting, and the corridor in October. He had told her of the bargain. He had told her of the Dowager's letter. He had told her, last, that he intended to keep the bargain, and that he would not be moved. Caroline sat for a long moment with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the fender. Then she said, "I should like to meet her at Whitsun. I should like to write to her in the spring. I do not care, Theodore, about Miss Cosway. Miss Cosway is a kind, beautiful, pleasant girl who is not in love with you. The woman who painted you in watercolor at 6 in the morning is. I think you should marry her, and I think Aunt Margaret shall come round, because Aunt Margaret has never in her life refused a person she has been forced to know. Promise me you will let me write to her. You may write to her tomorrow. I shall write to her tonight. She had written to her that night. Caroline's letter was 4 pages long, and contained, in among the cheerful school news, a sentence that Theodore had not until then known his sister capable of. I have heard, Miss Briar, that you have considered my brother to a degree he has not until now been considered by any woman of sense, and I am writing to thank you for it. Eliza, on receiving the letter, had taken her uncle into the front parlour at Pully, and had read the sentence aloud, and had then put her face in her 2 hands and laughed, very softly, until her uncle had said, Eliza, that is enough now, and had put a handkerchief into her hand. He wrote to her, in the end, 3 times a week. She wrote back twice. Her letters were short and very plain. She told him of her uncle's parish. She told him of the fossil her uncle had found in February, and had named, with no permission from the Royal Society, after his late wife. She told him she had been teaching the village children to draw on Tuesdays. She told him of a small commission for a miniature of an old sea captain who had given her half a crown and a kiss on the brow. She never once, in any letter, said she missed him. He understood why. He missed her, with the steady, unspectacular ache of a man who has set his hand on a hot stove and has decided not to lift it. Christmas in London came under a thin, cold rain. The lamps along Curzon Street were lit at 3 in the afternoon. The wet pavements doubled their yellow light. The carriages on Piccadilly threw small fans of muddy water against the curb. In the steady drizzle, the houses smelt of wet brick and chimney soot, and the smaller squares smelt of green winter laurel and damp railings. He spoke to his aunt at Christmas, when she came up to town to keep an eye on him. He spoke to her for an hour in her drawing room with the door shut. He told her what Eliza had said in the orchard. He told her of the bargain they had made. He told her, quite humbly, that he was attending every dinner she could think to put him at, and that he had asked Miss Cosway's mother for a great deal of advice on parish patronage, and that he intended to look the books in the face before March. He told her that he was not changing his mind. He was, however, being shown. The dowager poured them both a glass of something stronger than tea. She did not at once speak. You are a strange young man, Theodore, she said at last. I had thought you wedded to the form of the thing. I find you are wedded only to the substance of it. I cannot quite forgive Miss Briar for having seen this in you before I did. She has not asked to be forgiven. I know. That is what is unforgivable. I shall set about forgiving her in spring. I should like to meet her uncle the parson before I commit myself. You shall. And Theodore? Yes. I have, since you went away, looked at the books. I have written to your steward. I have looked at the slate on the cottages and the wages on the books and the rents and the matter of your sister's portion. We are not in such straits as I implied in October. I implied them to frighten you. I should not have done. You did not deserve to be frightened. You have always frightened me, he said. I have grown by it. You shall stop growing by it now. He kissed the back of her gloved hand. The fire in the small grate behind her had burned to copper coals. The lamp on the side table threw a soft yellow circle over the tea tray. He went home. He sat by the fire and read Eliza's last letter again. He thought, with a great calm in his ribs, that the bargain had been the right one. He thought that he had been a duke for 8 years now, and had only this winter learned to be a man. The end of the season approached in slow, grey degrees. February gave way to a bright, cold March that brought wind along the river and the first snowdrops to the small back garden of the townhouse. Theodore attended a final dinner at the Hertfords, a dance at the Penbridges, and a long, very dull breakfast at his aunt's, at which the Bishop of Salisbury was present, and at which Caroline, who had been brought up from Bath for the occasion, conducted herself with the grave attention of a girl who knew her brother was being looked at. The dowager said little that morning in defense of any of the candidates Theodore had been examining. She had, instead, twice asked the bishop about the parish of Pulley, and once, very mildly, of the Reverend Briar's reputation in matters of antiquity, and had received from the bishop the kind of plain, kind answer which is, in such interviews, the loudest possible verdict. March came in mild and wet. The crocus came up in purple drifts in the railed gardens of the squares. The first lambs were dropped in the home fields at Renham. The dowager went back to Hampshire. Caroline went back to Bath. Theodore stayed on in Curzon Street until the last sitting of the House, and then ordered the small chaise and 4 greys at 5 in the morning of the last Monday in March, and was, by 10 o'clock the same morning, on the Bath Road, with a leather portmanteau on the rack and a pencil case at his elbow, and the Reverend Briar's last letter folded into his breast pocket. He came down to Pulley in the last week of March. He had not told Eliza. He had told her uncle by letter. The Reverend Briar, who did not approve of dukes on general principle, had replied with a paragraph of unblinking sense and the postscript, "She does not yet know the year of your birth, nor the figure of your income. Inform her of both before you ask her. She will refuse you twice for form, and once for sense. Be prepared." Theodore folded the letter into his pocketbook and kept it. He stopped the chaise at the village inn at noon, watered the horses, ate a cold pasty and drank a half-pint of small beer at a window table, and walked the last half-mile up the lane on foot. He came up the lane to the vicarage on a wet, kind morning. The blackthorn was in flower. He saw her in the front garden, on her knees in the muddy bed by the gatepost, with her sleeves turned up and her hair the colour of wet oak in the rain. She did not at first hear him. He stood at the gate. She turned her head. She did not start. She sat back on her heels. "You have come without writing," she said. "I have come with a great deal of writing in my pocketbook." "Sit on the wall, Your Grace. I am not yet finished with my snowdrops." He sat on the wall. He watched her finish her snowdrops. She wiped her hands on her apron. She came and sat beside him. "I have been to every dinner my aunt could think of," he said. "I have danced with 7 young women, none of whom I have loved. I have looked the estate books in the face. My aunt sends you her regards, with which she will, in spring, send her blessing in person. I have been to Bath 3 times to see my sister Caroline, who is 16 and is reading Mrs. Edgeworth, and is most desperately keen to be introduced to a remarkable woman. I have read your letters, twice apiece, until I knew them. I have considered, every morning, whether I had been a fool. I have not been a fool. Theodore, will you do me the honour of marrying me, Miss Briar?" "Yes." "You have not refused me twice for form and once for sense." "I have refused you in March 3 times in my own head. You will have to take that on trust." "I take it on trust." He set his hand against her cheek. He felt the small, dark mould at the hinge of her jaw under his thumb. He felt the chipped tooth when she smiled. He kissed her once, very lightly, at the corner of her mouth, which was as much as the open road at the vicarage gate permitted. She put her forehead against his shoulder. "You took your time, Theodore." "You set the time." "So I did." A blackbird whistled from the hedge. The blackthorn beside them gave off a faint, cold sweetness. A bee, very early for the year, blundered into Theodore's shoulder and away. The vicarage chimney sent up a thin, clean ribbon of smoke against the grey March sky. The Reverend Briar came out of the vicarage at that moment with a half-eaten piece of bread and butter in one hand and a fossil in the other, and he looked at them over the top of the gatepost with the unblinking calm of a man who has been waiting for this morning for 11 weeks. "Miss Briar," he said. "Your Grace, there is tea inside." They went in. The vicarage parlour was a low, warm room with a deep stone hearth, a great deal of bookshelf, 3 small rugs, a piano under a cloth at the back wall, and on a table by the window a clatter of small flint and chalk fossils set out like the pieces of a long, slow argument. The Reverend brewed tea in a brown pot. He cut bread. He did not flatter. He asked Theodore 3 questions about the estate, 2 about the chapel at Renholm, and 1 about the bishop. He listened to the answers. He set the teapot down again and looked at his niece, who was standing at the window with her hands behind her back and her colour very high. "Well, Eliza," he said, "you have decided." "I have." "And you, Your Grace, have asked." "I have, sir." "Then we have nothing further to dispute. I should like to write to your aunt directly, if you will permit me. I should like to meet her at Whitsun. I should like to see your chapel. I should like, if it is not impertinent, to be told the proposed marriage settlement before the lawyers are called in, since my niece is, on her mother's side, the natural heir to a small parcel of orchard at Lyne, that I do not propose to let into the hands of any gentleman without an opinion of my own about it." "Yes, sir." "Good. Pass the butter." Theodore passed the butter. He felt, with the small bright humour that had been growing in him since October, that he had been examined by an old man in a cassock with more candour and more affection than by any man of business he had ever sat with in Lincoln's Inn. He liked the parson. He thought he might come to like him a great deal. The dowager came down to Pulley at Whitsun, as she had promised. She came in her own travelling coach, with a small leather case that contained, among other things, a folded paper she had not shown her nephew, and which she did not produce until she had sat with the Reverend Briar in his parlour for the better part of an hour, and had been brought a cup of tea by Eliza in the second-best china. She had unfolded the paper then. It was a settlement of £1,000 in the funds, in trust for any second daughter Theodore and Eliza might have, and the Reverend had looked at it for a long moment without speaking, and had then said, "Madam, you are very kind. The first daughter shall manage." The dowager had smiled at him, the first real, unhostile smile of her acquaintance with the south of England, and had set her cup down. She had said after a moment, "Mr. Briar, I should like to begin again. I have, in October, used my voice against my nephew's choice. I should now, in June, like to use it for him. I shall be glad if you will permit me to be useful to your niece." The Reverend, who was a man for whom a plain apology was the most welcome currency in the world, had said only, "Madam, you are quite welcome to her. We have raised her between us. We shall share her, I trust, with a free hand." They had shaken hands on it, like 2 old foxes meeting at the edge of a quiet wood. The week of the wedding was warm and dry. The hawthorn was out in great white drifts along the lanes. The bees worked the lime trees in the vicarage garden until the air under them was a low, golden hum. Eliza spent the 3 mornings before her wedding sitting in her uncle's parlour, finishing a miniature of her grandmother on a small chip of ivory, with the warm wind moving the lace curtain at her elbow, and Mrs. Lacey on a low stool in the corner, mending a fine linen handkerchief. The vicar sat at his table by the window, cataloguing a tray of fossils, and from time to time read aloud a sentence from a book on the conchology of the Dorset coast, and waited for his niece to laugh, which she always did. The wedding was held at Pulley in the 2nd week of June, in the small parish church, with the dowager in the front pew, and Caroline in a new bonnet, and the village children scattering snowdrops they had pressed since March between the pages of their drawing books. The church was small and old, with whitewashed walls and a single dark beam across the roof, and the morning light came in slanted and warm through the leaded panes of the east window. The smell of fresh hay rose from the floor of the porch. The smell of lime came in from the blossoming trees outside. The bell rope hung a slow length down by the chancel arch. The village had laid the aisle with new rushes. Heskett gave Theodore the ring. Mrs. Lacey gave Eliza her bouquet. The Reverend Briar married them with 3 sentences more than the book required, and a postscript he had clearly written himself. Theodore could not afterwards have repeated the postscript. He had been looking at the chipped tooth. There was a small wedding breakfast in the vicarage garden, on trestle tables under the lilac, where the village had brought, by their own initiative, baskets of cold pies and jugs of small beer, and a single great pyramid cake the squire's wife had baked. Eliza walked between the trestles with her hand on Theodore's arm, and stopped to speak to every cottager and to every child. The village children gave her, in slow turn, the snowdrops they had pressed between the pages of their drawing books since March, and she set them in her bouquet until there was no more room, and then she gave them back to the children to keep. Caroline, who had been brought down from Bath, was beside herself, and danced twice on the grass with a tenant farmer's son, who afterwards, 50 years later, told his grandchildren about the day a duke's sister had danced with him in a churchyard at noon in June. The Reverend Briar gave a short, unsentimental toast in praise of his niece's stubbornness. The Dowager gave a shorter, sentimental one in praise of her nephews. The Bishop, who had ridden over from Salisbury and was a man of long good humour, gave a third in praise of Patience, and the company cheered him with such goodwill that Heskett, standing in the back row in a clean black coat, was for the first time in his service seen by another servant to laugh. They went home to Wrenholme. The carriage took the road by way of Salisbury and Winchester, with the small chaise behind and the dowager's coach behind that, and the kitchen cart following with Mrs. Pike and a basket of cold pies. The chestnut trees along the road were in full leaf and threw heavy green shade onto the dust. The sky was a high, pale June blue. Eliza kept her hand in Theodore's the whole of the first stage. She kept her eyes on the long line of fields running past the window. She told him, in the small voice of a woman saving a thought she had been keeping a long time, that she had thought, on the morning of the 6th of October, when she finished her watercolour, that she would never tell any soul about it. He pressed her hand and looked at her without speaking. The carriage rocked. The dust came up off the road in slow gold curls. He thought, with the small private humour she had taught him in October, that he had become a man who knew when to keep silent in a moving carriage. The journey home took 2 days by easy stages. They slept the first night at a clean inn at Stockbridge, where the landlady, who had been told by her ostler that there was a duke in her small parlour, brought up with her own hands a hot pie and a pot of stewed apples and a jug of cream. Eliza ate her supper at a small deal table, with her sleeves turned up against the heat of the fire, and her hair just beginning to dry from the rain. Theodore watched her over the rim of his cup. He did not speak. He was, for a long quarter of an hour, the most contented man in the south of England. The October dream did not come back. He did not expect it to. He had only needed it once. They walked the long water on their first afternoon as husband and wife. The light was the warm yellow light of late June over still water, and the slow current at the south end laid small silver ripples against the stone of the bathing step. A heron stood on one leg in the shallow, exactly as if it had been told to be there. The reeds rustled. The trout rose in slow rings against the dark of the deeper pool. Eliza pulled off her glove and let her hand drift through the cold water, and laughed softly at her own coldness. And Theodore took her hand and dried it inside his own coat against his ribs, as he had done in the orchard in October. They sat by the heron and were quiet. They went up the back staircase to the painting room. He pulled the green linen away. She stood for a long time, and then she pulled the green linen away from her own canvas, the one she had carried from Pulley, wrapped in 2 woolen blankets, and they set them side by side. 2 faces in oil and watercolour, painted by 2 hands in 2 parishes on 2 mornings, looking at each other across nothing at all. "We shall keep them here," she said. "We shall keep them here. And one day, when we are very old, we shall show them to a granddaughter of ours, and we shall say, 'This is the night I knocked on your grandfather's door by mistake, and this is the morning he had painted me already.' And we shall tell her that there are facts in the world for which we have not yet earned the words." He laughed at her shoulder, in his shoulders, the way she had liked. "I have heard you laugh twice now," she said. "I shall do it again." She turned her face up to him. He kissed her properly, in the painting room, with both canvases watching. The fire in the small grate behind them crackled once and settled. Outside, in the great avenue of beeches that he had once counted to 97, the late spring wind moved through the leaves with a sound like a long, kind sentence ending well. They stood there a long time. Then they went down to supper, and the dowager rose at her place to greet them, and the long table was warm, and Heskett bowed at the door, and Wrenham, the great pale block of Portland stone with 22 windows along the south face, kept them, as it had kept his father's, and as it would keep, for many quiet years, the steady habit of their happiness.